So, moving on, we come to our final session, principal session. There's a lot of activity planned for this afternoon, and turn, I guess, to digital futures, inevitably, but also in the spirit of investigation and query. And to help us on our way, it's a great pleasure to welcome Paul Basu from UCL, where he's a reader in material culture and museum studies, and has a range of quite fascinating current research projects, including on Sierra Leone, but also recently on the Scottish Highlands, as has published widely, including with Sharon, and is going to talk to us today before we move on to the rest of the session. And here's someone just come in from the M25. He's currently moving cones. London's a funny place, we get all sorts of people. Sorry. It may bear some resemblance to a well-known TV presenter, but that is entirely coincidental. Paul, where were we?
Oh yes, yeah.
If we can,
thanks.
We can take the rights down. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Well, okay. So I've kind of got two halves to my paper. Not that I ran out of time halfway through writing one, of course. And I was wondering if they might map onto the material and the virtual. Possibly. We might stretch that. But so I'm going to vaguely. I'll start off probably reading more than making it up as I go along, but then we'll turn to making it up as I go along later. So the theme of this session is to consider the relationship between the material and virtual in the Museum of the Future, and to relate this to the broader question posed in this event regarding the role of museums in the globalisation of culture. Whereas an earlier generation of commentators tended to fetishise the virtual and draw hyperbolic conclusions about its imagined impact upon the real, we can now take a more sober view of new information and communication technologies. Indeed, the contribution of social anthropology to such discussions has largely been to demonstrate how quickly these extraordinary technologies become ordinary and incorporated into everyday social life. This is not to suggest that new technologies do not change our behaviour, but we should remember that these changes are embedded fundamentally in the material social worlds in which we live. Behind every second life avatar, there is, of course, a material first life incarnation. And I couldn't resist putting these images in of a second life. This is Osmosa, the open source museum of open source art, which is on Second Life. And I also couldn't resist, although it's got nothing to do with this talk, putting in this parody in a way that somebody's done, Get a First Life, with the intriguing invitation to go outside. Membership is free. First Life is described as a 3D analogue world where server lag does not exist. And so you find out where you actually fornicate using your actual genitals. So anyway, it's a bit beside the point perhaps. So it's not that Facebook-to-Facebook interaction supersedes face-to-face interaction, though of course it and other forms of computer-mediated communications may expand the means at our disposal to interact, and in so doing extend our social worlds and our networks. So, whilst an earlier invitation to participate in this event, and indeed in the summary that was sent round this morning, sets up an oppositional dichotomy between the material and the virtual, asking whether the future of museums lay in material or virtual domains. This has been amended, well, in the programme at least, to suggest a continuing coexistence, so the material and the virtual. Digital communication technologies do not threaten the existence of material museums. Indeed, just as the widespread use of digital technologies in museums has begun to take off since the latter 1990s, so of course we've seen a renewal of interest in the materiality of the museum itself, reflected not least in the spectacular architectural spaces of many new museum developments. Although, of course, we should also note the role of virtual reality-like computer modelling in contemporary architectural practice, which makes these buildings possible. And this is just the example of a proposed Museum of Modern Arab Art in Qatar. And the uncanny resemblance, actually, if you look at some of these architects' plans, as it were, to the Second Life context. You know, so there's some degree of blurring there. Thus, even though one does not threaten to displace the other, it is worth considering how the virtual impacts upon the material and how the material impacts upon the virtual, and this ought to be our objective. What, though, do we mean by virtual? Well, here again is a legacy of that hyperbolic discourse that earlier surrounded new digital media, the idea of virtual reality. A technology that allows a user to interact with an immersive, computer-simulated environment, an environment which, though simulated, presumably seems almost real. And although I suspect the organisers of this debate probably use virtual as a shorthand to refer to new digital technologies, it's worth dwelling for a moment longer on the connotations of this term to make a broader point about the nature of museums. Although or has been replaced with and in our programmes, this oppositional dichotomization lingers on in the pairing of material and virtual. The suggestion is that the material is real, whereas the virtual, by being almost real, is categorically not real. It is, in other words, artificial, lacking in authenticity, a simulation. Yet if the virtual may be opposed to the real, surely the opposite of the material is not virtual. We might better contrast the material with the immaterial, or in UNESCO speak perhaps, the tangible with the intangible. But the immaterial is clearly not less real than the material, and as we've already discussed, it needn't be less tangible either. So a consideration of this relationship between the material and the virtual is not the same as that between the material and the digital, or the material and the immaterial, and it provokes us to question what exactly is real or unreal in a museum context. As Peter Weibel and Bruno Latour have recently noted, a museum exhibition is deeply unrealistic. It is a highly artificial assemblage of objects, installations, people and arguments, which could not be reasonably gathered anywhere else. In an exhibition, the usual constraints of time, space and realism are suspended. End of quote. So as we know, most objects in a museum are divorced from the contexts which give them purpose and meaning. What is real about a stone hand axe when no one is allowed to handle it, least of all for the purposes which it was really created? Where does the reality of a material object inhere? But as Duchamp long ago demonstrated, the museum does not negate the reality of an object, it transforms it. Is this a real urinal or a real artwork? Or indeed both? And I'd rather like... Talking of interventions, we were yesterday. So this strikes me as, very much an intervention. These are the same two characters that jumped up and down on Tracy Emin's bed, of course. Oh. And, this idea that was suggested of the kind of invited intervention, which certainly wouldn't unsettle a museum professional maybe, but it's supposed to unsettle something. Whereas, of course, the museum professionals were deeply unsettled when people were using a urinal as for the purpose it was perhaps intended. So the reality of an object, our perception of it, our understanding of its function, our emotional response to it, is mediated by context. This includes the institutional framing of the object, our self-disciplined way of behaving in different institutional spaces, the meanings and values projected onto an object, for example through museum interpretation, labels and so forth, as well as the techniques of display, the gallery space, the pedestal, the vitrine. The museum then may be regarded as a media technology, and indeed, despite its potential to be otherwise, is still predominantly a visual medium. It is a myth that museums enable us to engage directly with the material objects in their collections. Hannah Arendt famously defined works of art as thought things, things that materialise thought, things to be thought about, and things to help us think. The museum is, perhaps above all, a medium that seeks to provoke us into such thinking, but we should also be aware of how the museum, its curators, designers, educators, text writers, security guards, and so forth, orchestrate our thinking and shape the reality of things. In the museum, there is no unmediated experience of the material. So perhaps the most obvious example of this kind of mediation can be found in the use of dioramas, for instance, which continue to be used in all kinds of museums, from natural history museums to archaeology and history museums, and we saw a good example of that in Dominic's example there. Or in open-air museums, for example, where whole village reconstructions might be made, peopled with live interpreters. Without doubt, these are simulated environments, and in the case of the open-air museum, they're certainly interactive ones, and you can actually taste the soup that this woman is making. And of course, this kind of virtual reality long predates the use of computers in museum spaces. Indeed, is as old as the institution of the public museum itself. And if one thinks of Basilius and the establishment of open-air museums, Stockholm 1873, Skansen 1891. The museum is, and always has been, a space of artifice and simulation. It has also been a space in which display technologies, information technologies, and new media forms have always been employed. The cabinet of curiosity, the vitrine, the label, the card index system, the text panel, the diorama, the contextualizing photograph, the projected moving image, the computerized collections management system, the touchscreen monitor. The museum is unthinkable without these, and we should thus avoid fetishizing the museum as the sacred space of the real, as a place in which one may encounter an unmediated materiality where thought things can speak directly to us. Far from being opposites or alternatives, the material and the virtual are inseparable in the museum context. Well, so much for the legacy of this term, the virtual. Personally, I think unless one's referring to these kind of VR simulations of museum environments, we should avoid that term and think in terms of a more prosaic kind of things like digital archive or digital access resource. Defetishizing new media in this way allows us to escape the hype and recognise the real value of computer-mediated communication technologies for museums. So what I wanted to do in the second half of the talk, as it were, is to have a look at some examples of this and then try and draw out from these examples some of the possibilities of digital media for museums, both thinking in terms of how the digital technologies influence physical museum spaces, but then also go beyond that and think about the kind of expanding reach of museums through the internet and so forth. And so as we go, I want to kind of collect some themes, as it were, from this, and then hopefully draw some kind of a conclusion relating that back to the issue of the of globalisation. So I'll kind of now start to waffle, probably. So we've spoken about the Musée de Quai Branly a couple of we've already been introduced to this, but one thing that hasn't been mentioned in relation to it, and we've heard the critique of its kind of particularly aesthetic approach to the display or redisplay of ethnographic collections. One thing I think that and again, I'm familiar also with the critique, the political critique of how this museum and its particular approach has come about. But it is also interesting to look at how the digital was always part of the vision, and we might think that this has or hasn't been a particularly successful combination. But certainly, part of the idea was always that there are two kinds of museum display practice going on at Quai Branly at one time. One is this exaggeratedly kind of aesthetic, decontextualized approach, which we've been critiquing, as it were. Another is the use of digital technologies, though, in those spaces to provide the contextualization. So whilst the objects are almost divorced entirely from context, and you have to struggle to see even the one-line kind of description of objects on a label, dotted around the gallery space are various other kinds of media technologies which attempt to recontextualize these objects, and through different kinds of multimedia, through moving image, still image, text, sound, files, and so on. So one of the things to think about here is how the digital technology can influence, can shape the physical space of the gallery, let's say. And this is also at Quai Branly, where you have these touch screens in this bizarre kind of sculptural kind of form that runs down the middle of the museum. And you huddle around these things, and they're actually rather good or well-designed multimedia resources in terms of the kinds of information that they provide. And I'll try and draw attention, of course, to the limitations of these things whilst kind of looking at the possibilities too. And of course, one of the limitations of a little touchscreen like that is, really one person can operate it at a time in a museum space, and there are maybe 8 of these dotted around. So whether you can actually get access to them is perhaps not so clear. But clearly there's an objective going on here, which is about how you can use technologies to provide much greater contextual information about objects by using these kind of multimedia applications. So we talked about multiple labelling and so on. Well, these are indeed multiple kind of labelling devices, if you like. They're much more dynamic than that too. So one of these topics that I wanted to kind of draw out, and I've lost complete track of time.
Me too.
Yeah, right. Is the idea, and this also links to, was it Susan, you were talking of your R's, 6 R's or something? I've got lots. Several million R's. Yeah. I've got lots of R's too, and probably some of them link to yours. And a lot of them are REs as well, like re. Yeah. So recontextualization is another of those R's. Recontextualizing objects on display through these kinds of technologies. Now, this kind of playfulness of these different modes of museum display is also something that is very evident in the African gallery at the Tropen Museum in Amsterdam. And again, the playfulness is represented here in a way. So here we have the kind of classic Quai Branly-like display that we tend to be familiar with, of this display of African masks, for instance, beautifully lit, some kind of minimal information at the bottom. But the designers of this gallery specifically wanted to use this as a way of contrasting with what lies through the doors adjacent just here, and I'm sorry, this is still a bit there's still a bit too much light here to see all of this very clearly, but hopefully you can make it out. So you go through those doors and you enter a rather different space. And in this space, rather than just these masks divorced from their costumes, let alone divorced from all the other performative elements of what a mask is in these contexts, is you're kind of surrounded now by these masks reunited with their costumes, and at your own level, as it were, at eye level, kind of real life size. But that's not all, of course, because what you're doing is entering into some kind of multimedia environment here too. And through this touch screen here, you can basically, well, I'll try and show you what happens. You can, I'll show you a plan here, so you get some sense of the geography of the place. You've got three. Has anyone been to see this gallery? Yeah. So some of you can probably describe it better than I can. You've got three screens effectively, and originally they wanted you literally. The designers originally wanted you to be completely surrounded with them, but with these masquerade figures. But in the end, you've just got surrounded on three sides, as it were. Here is this little touch screen. The glass, this is the big thing with this technology. The glass actually, if you put an electric current through it, instead of being transparent, it becomes opaque and you can project images onto it. So what happens is you select the mask that you want to experience, and I'll take you through a sequence of photographs which show what happens. So I have to admit I've forgotten what this mask is, but it's from kind of Central Africa. So let's use that as the example. So you click this, the room goes dark, the surrounding screens become opaque, just leaving this one that you've selected apparent. And the initial, and these are moving images, of course, and I'll try and convey that in a little bit. But just so I can talk about it, I'll just
we're
use
just
these
going to
stills.
try and lower the lights, but you
Yeah.
will no longer be able to read your.
Oh yeah, I'm not really reading now, as you might have gathered.
Right.
Yeah.
Is that all?
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah.
We can't see you.
I'm fine. You're supposed to be looking at the screen anyway. Oh, that's good. Can I start my thing again? So, yes, so you basically are provided with some geographical kind of contextualizing material, so you know where to place this, as it were. Some information about how this mask and the costume found its way to the museum. And then basically you're surrounded by sounds and moving images with some quite minimal information again through these kind of subtitles. And the curator and designer of this, again, originally wanted you to be really engulfed by this. And certainly they'd imagined this exhibition long before the technology actually became available to make it happen. So in some respects, and it was the glass technology which was actually the thing that made it possible. So you become, you're surrounded as if you were witnessing this masquerade performance itself. And indeed, depending on what archive footage they've managed to gather, they kind of replicate this by the fact that you become, they've got images also of people observing the masquerades themselves. On these three screens, you have a very dynamic kind of relationship between the moving images. And then the end of maybe the program, maybe it just lasts for 2 or 3 minutes, and then the room returns to the original setup. Now, I did try and just I wasn't equipped particularly well when I went to see this, but I did try and just record a little bit of this on my just ordinary little digital snappy camera kind of thing. So here you might get some sense of this here. Okay, so you get an impression, at least, of that, even if it's dark and murky here, I'm afraid, because of that. But so another of these themes, then, that I wanted to draw out is reanimation. So this idea that through recontextualizing, but not just by providing a bit of text or something like that, but by bringing an object in, kind of juxtaposing it with these kinds of moving images and so on, you're actually bringing an object back to life in some kind of a way, and contrast that with the very static display of those masks outside this room. Okay, so recontextualization, we could add remediation, reanimation. So I want to turn now to look at the kind of use of digital media outside the museum walls, as it were, and think of particularly some online resources. I want to start with just 3 examples from the Pitt Rivers Museum, for example, and I will be focusing, as you'll probably have gathered, on rather ethnographic type of displays again. My own bias there, I suppose. So here's an example of, this is the Forster collection at Pitt Rivers of Pacific art. So these were collections made during Cook's second voyage and so on in the Pacific. And again, it's really a question of what this is doing, what this is providing that in a way can't be done easily in the physical space of the gallery. In terms of the background information, and I won't take you through all of these things, but background information about who's collecting, the context of the collection, the history of the collection, an ability to explore images of the collection and accompanying documentation that exists, bibliographic resources and so on. So it's a kind of, it becomes a research resource as well, something that you can explore. So again, one of these themes is obviously access to collections that might otherwise not be available because they may be in stores or so on, or because the contextualizing information is hidden away in relatively inaccessible articles or in the museum's archive itself. One of the interesting things about this resource is what's called the Pacific Pathways option here, and this is where users can actually select objects from this archive of objects and related information and import them, as it were, into, or create a pathway from them. Select an object, add their own information, their own narrative, and then articulate them, as, if you like, as an online exhibition. So here's an example of one of these, and you can see links to 9 objects that Rosanna Raymond, in this case, has selected and creates a narrative. So you go through this sequence of things. So it's about navigation, and that's another of these kind of words. We're talking about a museum-type environment which has a surplus of information, if you like, a surplus of materials. So it's this archival mode of engaging with it, okay? There's more than you could actually take in particularly in a kind of a museum visit, which might last, an hour or two. But you can navigate your way through this and make your own narrative pathway, if you like. So there's also a democratization, if you like, of knowledge, insofar as you have the ability to put your own story up here, to find your own way through. You're not being told from the kind of the expert point of view how you should understand these things. So just to move on to some other examples, this is the, does anyone know better than I how to pronounce Luau? Anyway, Luau Visual History Project. And I wanted just to show this one, because again it has similar kinds of access. I won't go over all of that again, but to make the point that these can also connect with grounded field work. So part of the objective here was to make a photographic collection of a particular area in East Africa available through the website, and to articulate that in different ways by categories and so on. But this was accompanied by a visual repatriation project. So physical prints of the same photographs were taken to this area in East Africa, and work was done with the descendants of the people who photographed and so on, collecting the information. So there was a kind of a two-way exchange. And this builds on this idea of the museum as a relational entity, the relational museum idea, which is about human relationships as much as it's about collections of things or stuff. So it's this idea of extending this. So it's about that reach and about how these needn't be exclusively about digital or material domains, but can bridge them. Another example is of the Pit Rivers one is the Tibet album here, and again you can see here various things. You can create an album here, feedback, zoom. You can look at these photographs in complex ways through digital technologies, allowing you to zoom very close to them. You can look at diaries, you can see original albums of how they were articulated. You can create your own albums. So again, emphasising this kind of archival resource, I think. I'm probably running a little bit out of time, so I'll whiz through the last few examples. Just in browsing around these kinds of resources, I think Brooklyn Museum has a really useful kind of user interface in its kind of website, for instance. Is anyone familiar with this site, for instance? No? This is really helpful. You are. Good. For a number of reasons. Again, it's basically the museum catalogue online with the typical information, culture, medium, place made, dates, these kind of very particular categories. But one of the interesting things here is that you can add categories. You can add tags. And I don't know if people are familiar with tagging, but this idea that, well, what keywords do you associate with a particular object? So these kinds of keywords are things that museums typically associate with objects. But you can add your own tags in this case, for instance, okay? So we're in the world of what's sometimes called folksonomies, not taxonomies, but folksonomies. This idea that you can actually define yourself. So you have some examples of how different people, cow, horns, which may not have been things that appeared in the original catalogue, as it were, description. But you could also add much more, wacky things potentially. You also have the ability to comment, and I'll just kind of link quickly to the... See if our technology is holding up here. Yeah. There we go. So you've got the ability to add comments, and actually it's interesting, if you explore this site you will find examples where people have contested what the museum's information is about these objects, and they leave this debate up there. So you can see the curator then responds, thanks, yeah, we've taken that off now, and it no longer says this kind of incorrect thing, and then someone else might add something else. So again, this idea of democratizing, but also building knowledge networks. So again, that's another of these terms, knowledge networks, and how they can kind of expand. But again, useful little things. You've got on this one here, for instance...
Though crafted by men, all three of the masks in this display case were worn by women. Curator William Siegman.
This is the only place in all of Africa where women actually perform with wooden carved masks. And the masks are made to be used by the principal leaders of the Sunday Society. They represent the guardian spirits of the society, the Ndolejowe.
The sun.
So again, you've got your... It's not quite the person in the gallery leading you round, but if you want the authoritative kind of voice, and of course there could be more than just one voice in these presentations and so on, you've got that context and so on. Another site, I'm running out of time, but I just want to show you a couple of other sites. One is this, which the Lakota winter counts. Winter counts are these kind of like calendar-like things drawn on hides usually. Each image stands for a year, and this is just a tremendously rich digital resource, which includes contextual information. It includes detailed discussions of the actual winter counts themselves. And I just wanted to show you a little clip just to give you some sense of the way it connects with communities too. Reproducing some typical framing things there as well, exoticizing techniques as well, so it doesn't escape those necessarily. But let me just show you an example of...
My name is Phyllis Young, and I'm an original resident of community here in Fort Yates. My husband is Eugene Pepper Young. We are both original people from Long Soldier community. We both lived along the river, and we both went off to different places, and we both came back and knew each other in our youth, and we married and we raised our children here. And
okay, again, just to give you a sense of how oral histories, for instance, work and how they link with collections and so forth. Okay, I'm just going to skip on a little bit. Quick point here is that the examples I showed you so far have been where museums, often quite well-resourced museums, have set up these things reaching out to communities, of course. Well, of course, the opposite can happen too, and that you can have communities able to access resources, create such sites for the community themselves. I was going to talk about a project I'm working on at the moment, but we don't need to worry about that, because I wanted just to bring this back to our globalisation theme briefly. So, clearly, I mean, and someone suggested a rather typical example of globalisation all being about the kind of this reach out, this kind of UNESCO idea that you mentioned of reaching out communities and widening access, and this kind of being some kind of celebratory idea of globalisation. I mean, we don't know really the impact of these kinds of resources yet. That kind of work hasn't been done, and indeed in this project in Sierra Leone I'm working on, part of the objective is to actually try and do some of that kind of work. But what we see in these kinds of technologies is that the museum, which is already part of the kind of global, the very idea of the museum, as we all know, is part of this globalizing process. But what we're seeing through these kinds of media is them entering also this, to use a Padurais term, this part of this global mediascape, and all that that implies in terms of its reach and so on. So the other kind of key thing is this idea of reconfiguration of what a museum is. Some of the implications for this then, the idea of the relational museum and how that impacts in terms of these globalization themes, knowledge flows, knowledge networks, but also frictions that's already been raised. The impact that this has in terms of, for instance, knowledge, so we're seeing a creolization perhaps of knowledge, maybe on the other hand we're seeing an indigenization of knowledge as well as a globalization or so on. Clifford and others' idea of the contact zone of the museum. So what we're seeing is a widening, in a way, of the contact zone of the museum. We're seeing a space for dialogue, an articulation, of course, but we're also seeing an area in which disagreement and disarticulation can take place. And of course, with these kinds of technologies, I haven't really gone into that, the whole issue of the digital divide, okay, to escape the idea that the digital is somehow widely accessible. In fact, it's very narrowly accessible. Where I'm working in Sierra Leone, very few people have access to electricity, let alone computers and the internet and so on. But how does the museum, for instance, negotiate that? In the Winter Counts example, that uses Flash, for instance, Flash player, plugins and so on. These are actually sophisticated kinds of technologies that only work if you have a really fast internet connection and so on. So we're seeing differentials, there are certainly frictions involved there. So we're seeing these scapes, like the mediascapes, as being overlapping but also disjunctive. and the kind of broader issues of, well, whose categories are we talking about? Is this gesture, for instance, from the Brooklyn Museum to say, well, we can use alternative categorizations of objects? Is that really going to happen? Because at the end of the day, this has to be mediated through this technology, and which relies on a digital literacy, which is often overlooked as well. And I just wanted to end with this image, which goes back to kind of O-level science, and the idea of interferences, because it strikes me as, you know, museums are involved in interfering with the world, particularly at the moment in these kind of outreach kinds of initiatives. And it's just to kind of recollect that interference can be both destructive, as it's often portrayed in kind of an anthropological kind of critique, that we shouldn't kind of interfere, but interference can be constructive as well, so that you end up with this kind of complex kind of wave form, let's put it like that, where some kind of interferences can produce positive kind of results, others have a destructive influence. So it's not very helpful in resolving anything, but it kind of partly sits on the fence, but recognise the reality of the situation too, maybe. Thanks.
Very good to hear from someone who not only remembers O-level, but clearly passed physics.
Oh no!
So, such a rich and interesting full presentation, Paul. I'm so sorry we didn't hear more about the Sierra Leone material, but maybe you can allude to that in some of the discussion afterwards. We now continue with the remainder of the panel, so if they would all like to come forward and check that their, not their virtual technology, but their digital technology is all working, we'll then proceed. Do you all have presentations already?
Yeah,
already
uploaded.
So we begin the rest of the panel with Maria Toscano. Toscano, sorry,
Toscano. With you.
So Maria is from Naples, where you did your PhD, and PhD has begun to be turned into articles and books, and that was on the cultural exchange, Venice, the Veneto and Britain. And today Maria is going to be talking about the museum between modern and postmodern, real or virtual. So in your own time.
In these last 10 years, I have been studying, identifying and defining the naturalistic antiquaries, a particular sort of enlightened intellectuals and collectors who followed Bacon and Buffon in applying the scientific inductive method with its reliance on material evidence to the study of history. This gave rise both to original researches and to informational collections combining naturalist and antiquarian items, which were also rich in images that reproduced the sites in which the scholars were interested. This approach originated in Great Britain and found favor in particular among the intellectuals orbiting around the Royal Society and Society of Antiquaries in the years of presidency of Joseph Banks, who was the one who organized both the expeditions of Endeavour with Captain Cook. About this theme, this naturalist antiquarian approach originated from fundamental requirement to rationalize humanities. It extended the experimental method to historical studies, matching the critical analysis of sources with direct observation of places and objects that in most cases the scholars themselves went to excavate. Starting from Buffon's concept of histoire naturelle as history of earth and history of mankind combined, and in Italy from Panstoricismo Vicchiano, history became one of the principal aims of human knowledge, and the central role of time, of which is speaking about this morning Lars, is something that sounds familiar to me. And a common field in which sciences as apparently heterogeneous as chemistry, geology, antiquarianism, and philology could contribute to the reconstruction of the past. Written reports, in most cases never published, were considered by naturalists just the final phase of a wider speculative activity that started from the careful observation of sites, went on to collection of geological and archaeological remains, and then ended with the description of both the observation and the object found. The main purpose of their researches was to record every kind of documents, written on paper, carved in stone, or simply impressed by an extinct animal species, in order to try to reconstruct or preserve even a small portion of history. So time but also space were the two main guidelines for this kind of scholar. Just for this reason, the naturalist antiquarians were strongly opposite to the general theories and deductive Cartesian method, considering them to be devoid of any contact with reality and so untrue, at least partially. They thought that it was completely useless, claiming to formulate presumptuous hypotheses about the meaning of the entire universe when men could hardly understand the things they touched and saw. The time and space of nature are too wide and complex to be comprehended as a whole by men. It is difficult to catch the matter in the fact, said William Hamilton, one of the most famous and representative naturalist antiquarians, who had a central role in the discipline's diffusion in Italy and in particular in Kingdom of Naples. This particular historiographic method, centered around material documents and visual testimonies, drove the naturalist antiquarians, scholars, to arrange composed collection in which books, images, and the objects were closely linked and found their real sense as a whole, representing, so to speak, the tangible part of their own studies, or, in other words, the experimental proof of the statements in their text. Despite the heterogeneous naturalist component, it is important to stress that the ultimate goal of visiting the collection of naturalist antiquity was exclusively taxonomic and instructive. Each item and the place assigned to it was the starting point and stimulus for the advancement of learning, above all for the collector himself and hence also for his visitor. So, although certain aspects of such collection may be said to have derived from the sphere of Wunderkammer, the collection themselves represented the exact opposite and the negation of such an approach. In fact, they sought to include what was typical and typological, not what was monstrous or rare, and although they may have contained objects referred to as curiosity, these were displayed not so as to provoke amazement, but rather to foster an understanding of history of art. In short, whereas the Wunderkammer solicited wonder, as the word suggests, the naturalist antiquarian collections were designed to elicit reflections. And these are some cases of collection, naturalist antiquarian collection. These are the principal characters of this story. Joseph Banks on the left, and on central, William Hamilton and his famous wife, Emma Hart. And these are some of this reproduction of the sites. Look at these men, these scholars running away from the Vesuvius erupting in very. And so there were, in most cases, the painter depicted himself drawing to show that he was really on the spot. Encyclopedic, cosmopolitan, and philanthropic enlightened culture generated most of modern society main characters. Museums themselves, as a public institution, born and developed greedily in the second half of 18th century, starting from British Museum and lately many others as Museo Pio Clementino in Rome or Real Museo Borbonico in Naples, a large number of collections, basically of antiquities and paintings, belonging to noble family or private institutions were opened with two principal aims, conservation and education. In fact, preserve the object means preserve history, and allow people visiting them means to improve knowledge, which was considered the first step to improve society. But these first museums were destined and thought for a learned elite, noble voyageurs, scholars, artists, while Louvre, from 1793 onward, it is to be considered probably the first public museum, as truly open to everyone who wanted to visit it, starting from the idea that history is a common heritage of any nation, and so a common good. In fact, this is the first case in which the collection itself belonged to the French state, not to the French, and so to the French people. Education was the only criterion of arrangement of museum collections, also until the first decades of 19th century. With the development of Romanticism and idealistic aesthetic concept, emerged another idea of museum as a place in which one not only could learn, but could feel himself involved in a kind of ascetic process completely independent from the rational understanding of objects, and from any knowledge about what kind of society and when and why they were produced. This passage from Illuminist to Romantic criteria appears with evidence in the diatribe between Alois Hirt and von Humor to one side, and Wagen, Humboldt, and Friedrich Schinkel, famous creator of Altes Museum in Berlin. The question was how to organize the exposition of the central round room. The first two had wanted to traditional taxonomic organization. The architect and his friends maintained that it was better to exhibit in the hall the masterpieces setting apart chronological succession. At the end of the day, Schinkel party won, and anybody knows, and in fact a large part of Berlin intelligentsia was strongly influenced from Hegel in person, teaching in those years in the same city. So starting from those years, museums became also a place to build up to elicit emotions. In 2 centuries, step by step, through the fundamental exemplar cases of MoMA, recreation of spirit has become true entertainment, widely considered the third and sometimes the main aim of nowadays museums. In fact, if the young first director of MoMA, Alfred Dahl, rendered the museum far more communicated with the diffusion of low-pricing catalogues and open to a wider categories of contemporary art as photography and films, the invention of Beaubourg by Richard Rogers and Renzo Piano as an osmotic and flexible place where people could penetrate and also just meet, restitute the museum as a cultural institution to popular culture of the time. Then the spreading of education also in the lower sectors of society and possibility to make cheap long trips traveling by boats and low-cost flying companies had been among the causes of the growing phenomenon of mass tourism that constricted curators and directors to go straight on this way and equate museums to enormous number of people touring work, adjoining facility and toilets and restaurants welcoming serving to one end, and making the exhibition itself capable to communicate to a larger number of people. In some cases, this has meant favor entertainment to the detriment of education and consequently a strong lower level of information in quality and quantity. From labels to catalogs, even if in many museums there is now the possibility for the more learned or interested to have a larger number of information through digital technologies. The preference for the entertainment provoked changes also in organization of the objects. In fact, it is day by day more frequent to see museums and temporary exhibitions in which the items are arranged apparently without any criterion to shock the visitor and to suggest unusual relationships. Among museums that more frequently propose this kind of non-chronological or non-taxonomic exhibition, there is the Tate Modern in London, no doubt one of the most positive exemplars of contemporary museum. But the brave decision with the initiative Dangerous Liaisons to expose portraits by Fuseli and Bacon, Gainsborough and Hockney side by side, risked to have sense just for the eye-educated few. So someone could find this choice amazing or fascinating, but a few will understand why it has made for, and quite nobody will apprehend something new about history or history of art. The foundation of the icon, soon after the Second World War, was an attempt to establish precise rules and common standards for conservation and communication of world, cultural and natural heritage. From this moment onward, a growing number of museums had the necessity to set up alarm systems to acquire instruments to be aware of coefficient of humidity and temperature, to control quantity and quality of light, and so on. As a consequence, museums have become more and more similar on regard of caring and services. That's why, since the first years of the 80s or 20th century, most of the major museums in the world tried to go against this trend, rediscovering the specificity of their own institution and collections, stressing the provenance of each item, or restoring furniture, or even the colors of the wall of the 18th century, without renouncing to facilities or safety standards, as had been made in London National Gallery and in Louvre. He is in particular the architect Min Pei rightly left the strong 19th century allure of some section, as in the case of the one dedicated to Egypt, uncovering heating, lights and every kind of wire. The danger of the homologation is far stronger for museums of contemporary art, in which is not only the arrangement but the collection itself that risks to be too similar. Anybody knows about the controversial phenomenon of the Guggenheim museums, defined museum enfranchising by Carsten Schubert. This strong homologation among museums discourages visitors who don't find any peculiar relationship between themselves and the museum, nor any reason to enter it, when they can see more or less the same things everywhere. So these, so to say, global museums not only don't belong to everyone, but to no one truly. The problem of homologation is extended in particular to the most part of museums of contemporary art, in which are generally represented the same famous international artists, and rarely, for example, less famous but local artists, except in few cases at Abteiberg Museum or in Mönchengladbach and Tate Modern in London, in which the fundamental difference is given by the harmonious and unique relation between container and content. In other words, between museography and museology. In my opinion, the solution to this situation that risks to make museums redundant is to create smaller museums and differentiate their collections, trying to relate them as much as possible with the local culture. A good example of this kind of museums is represented by ones dedicated to single artists, as Musée Picasso alle Alpari, or Donald Judd Foundation in Malta, Texas, or Museo Burri in Città di Castello, Umbria. Another positive experience, genuinely Italian, can be individuated in the civic museums with a peculiar personality, whose dimensions are limited and whose collections represent and preserve specific public memories of a single community. Another common characteristic of contemporary museums is the use of modern technologies, such as PC terminals, to allow the more interested visitors to consult multimedia sources, or particularly in the archaeological museums, to reconstruct the original context through the help of PC graphic. Digital resources are also used in museums dedicated to the memory of difficult phenomena of history, such as war or Holocaust, and even more in natural history or science museums. Ralph Appelbaum said that nowadays science museums are museums of concepts rather than of objects. In the museums of this first kind, PC are frequently present to give the visitor more information and also to suggest questions or to present the problem itself. But it is also true in this specific museum, museums, lights, sounds, and exhibition of the objects themselves are thought to elicit emotions rather than to inform, as anyone can see in the section dedicated to the Holocaust in London Army Museum. Museums dedicated to science or natural history, on the other hand, are thought above all for children, so curators generally try to make visits as interactive as possible in order that young visitors can get themselves involved directly in the facts presented through the use of PC or other digital instruments, thought basically to entertain. But this prevalence of entertainment upon education and even more of facts upon things could cause a deep change in our idea of museum, making it something completely different from the cultural institution originated by philanthropic ideas of illuminists. So museums should rediscover the real sense of themselves to understand this global and maybe dangerous process. A recent initiative of British Museum called Please Touch is very significant in this sense. For 1 or 2 hours a day, visitors were allowed to see closely and touch some of the objects of collections with the help of a museum assistant who will not only look after the precious item but also speak about its history. In that way, visitors have both all the information they need and the rare privilege to physical contact with a work of art. At the other end, the Museo Archeologico Virtuale of Ercolano, and you see the main entrance, it's a typical postmodern museum, recently inaugurated in a famous city in province of Naples, placed in the very neighboring of the remains of the ancient city. This museum consists shortly in a series of rooms reproducing a part of the most attractive spot of the archaeological site nearby. So visitors, after a process defined of dematerialization with strange lights and sound, it's grotesque, are ready for the first room, where one can see faces and hear voices of the inhabitants of the ancient Herculaneum. Then enter the so-said Villa dei Papiri, and passing through a virtual pyroclastic cloud to some monuments of the ancient Vesuvian cities, to the Villa dei Papiri library, to Terme, and obviously Lupanare. As the name itself suggests, this museum is built up with a profusion of holograms, projections, light, a wide diffusion of informatic device to whom is dedicated the whole central section, no doubt the most interesting one, in which there is the possibility to watch in high definition the reproduction of most of the mural paintings served in Museo Archeologico Nazionale in Naples. Moreover, amazement of visitors seems to have been the principal aim of the curator, as it emerges even in the text of the website, characterized by the utilization of a large number of words related to this semantic area. Defined a contemporary site to the past, whatever it will mean, a contemporary site to the past, this new institution looks more like a modern installation of contemporary art or a thematic park rather than a museum. In my opinion, it acquires sense just if considered in its reliance with the real side of excavations. I mean, as an essential section of them dedicated to children, education and entertainment. Otherwise, it would be in fact a museum without object, and so stricto sensu, not properly a museum because it is without object. I think that there is a general need of real contact with things. So making museum more and more virtual means to ignore the most genuine essence of museum and the role it had been playing in the modern culture. Museums are not to be considered common places made simply to have fun, but instead temples, life temples, where preserve and hand down material memories, where people can, in a sense, meet the history through the object. The presence of the things is essential to present fact, despite all digital resources that we could have or at our disposal nowadays. The contact with the real is important for us postmodern people and even more for our children, so unaccustomed to the real. Museum had been and ever will not the place of the virtual, but the place of the real.
Thank you very much. I sense a dialogue developing within the people on this panel. So let us move to our next presentation, and we want to have plenty of time for discussion, so we'll move along quickly. And our next speaker is Uta Protz, who is currently at currently split between the EUI, where you've finished your PhD, and the Saxo Institute in Public University of Copenhagen, having studied, well, everywhere, Cambridge and the Courtauld and Birkbeck, and then latterly at the EUI. And Uta today is going to talk to us about globalisation in the museum, material realities, virtual possibilities. So we're still at that dichotomous stage that we heard about earlier.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Personally, I found all panels and all contributions really, really useful. So hugely appreciated, as well as your introduction, Paul. And I feel I'm talking on something very broad, where very specific issues have already been raised. So it's a little bit difficult, because I think some point that's quite important to mention in advance is that, of course, there's such a different scale of museums. I mean, ranging from quite smaller local entities working very much on intangible heritage, to such museums like the British Museum taking on a foreign policy role. So we've really had like a very, very broad scope. I should also say that I've divided my presentation into 3 sections. The first one being on display and interpretation, the second one on communication and education, and the third one on management and funding. And in a way, I think this reflects probably my background, having worked in business for quite a long time, that it's great to have huge ideas, but if there's not funding in place and if there's no management in place to actually put these initiatives, turn them into reality, you really have a problem. So I'm going to advance some quite bold statements, and when I wrote the little bit on outreach, I knew half of you will jump at me. It's intentionally very provocative, because, as I will explain, it's really with the consideration of funding behind it, which way you want to go. Of course, I would really like to see everybody having the maximum access and opportunity in the museum, so I'm not a total snob, as may come across from the paper. But anyway, globalisation, as I start off, in its literal sense, is the transformation of local and regional phenomena into global ones. It's highly complex, it's frequently a very divisive process, and it involves many different forces, such as cultural ones, economic ones, political ones, social ones, technological ones, and so on and so forth. It is not something entirely new. It has in fact been apparent since at least the 16th century, but especially post-1989 has resulted in an ever closer interaction between people and cultures, and I would argue an ever faster level of communication and development. So many of us now engage with the world in just one day. If you live and work in London, for example, your local bus is likely to be driven by a person of either Caribbean or Nigerian origin. Your call to your local bank is likely to be answered by voice in Hong Kong or India. Your international post will be postmarked in Australia or New Zealand because it's cheaper, and your computer probably has been worked on in the United States but then assembled in either Ireland or Poland. So whatever you do, you're dealing with all of that. This does not mention the Nicaraguan coffee you enjoyed in the morning, the Chinese takeaway you had at lunch, or indeed the self-invented ethno-mix you're going to fry up for dinner. At least that's what happens with me. This increasingly international interaction, however, does not mean that we necessarily have gained a better understanding of and higher level of respect, unfortunately, for all the people and cultures we engage with on a daily basis. And I think, and this is the main point of my paper here, that it is here that museums, as the guardians and interpreters of artifacts representing human diversity and its manifold achievements, can and must play a central role, and even more so in the future. So, as the world becomes increasingly faster and interconnected, at the same time in many ways dislocated and disoriented, museums, and I here move to the kind of elite end of museums, such as the British Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and to a certain extent the Musée du Louvre, I would argue ideally placed to further understanding and respect for the other, at the local level, the regional level, as well as the global level. The effort is and will be vital to give globalisation a human face and to assure peaceful coexistence into the future based on a better understanding of each other. But our museums, as they have historically grown and present themselves today, and I appreciate that there's a huge variety, you can't generalize, but nonetheless, we'll take it from here. Are they ready to take on the challenges ahead? I would argue not necessarily, unless they firstly review how they display and interpret their collection in the present and the future. Secondly, how they use communication and education to really maximize their museum. And thirdly and lastly, how they will actually address the issue of change management and the funding behind it. So display and interpretation. Well, this has been the subject of extensive research for a long time. And we do all know that classification of artifacts has radically changed over time. So we've seen this before. While the Renaissance collector, and I here show you the Kunstkammer, the Cabinet of Curiosity of Ole Worms in Copenhagen, while at the time artifacts were divided into generally artificial and curiosity, and in his case also material. So on the upper tier here you have metal objects next to liquor objects and mineralia. This really changed in the 18th century with the publication of the Dictionnaire raisonné, the Encyclopédie au Dictionnaire raisonné des sciences, des arts et des métiers, is published by Alembert et Diderot starting from 1751. What happened as a result of this was a complete reordering in many museums of artifacts, usually into national schools, followed by chronological order, and then, in the case of art museums, individual artists or regional schools. So I here show you a plan of the Imperial and Royal Gallery in Vienna, as it was published by Christian von Mechel, who was a Swiss publisher in Basel in 1784. What you see is that it was an art collection in this case, set out on 2 floors, and on the lower floor you had Netherlandish masters to the left, you had Italian masters to the right. When you went upstairs, you had the German school, and you had lower Netherlandish, something else I can't quite remember. So there's definitely here a national division of objects, and it was intended to render the history of art more visible. It is a form of display and interpretation still largely followed by galleries today, galleries and museums today. So thinking about the British Museum, you have an Africa gallery, you have a North American gallery, so the starting point or starting division is geographical. And I would like to argue that this perhaps is not the most appropriate way to display collections in the present and more importantly into the future. At a time when geographical distance and political division has become increasingly less pronounced, I'm thinking about the juxtaposition of the US and the Soviet Union not being there, and obviously there's other political tensions and there's new political tensions coming up. Would it not be a more constructive approach to display and interpret art and artifacts by theme rather than continent or nation? This would not only help to eliminate study of the differences as well as the similarity, this would not only help to study the similarities and differences between people, but it would also help to actually break down prevailing hierarchies often inherited from the colonial age. It's still often quite rare to find this. It's relatively frequent to see a thematic approach in British museums. Once you reach the continent, it's a lot less. So at the British Museum, there's one gallery in particular which has been very successful adopting a thematic approach, which is the Wellcome Trust Gallery, where you have objects from across the world in the same gallery, looking at how living and dying has been interpreted both across space and time. So you have, for example, a ritual object used to celebrate the birth of a child in Africa next to modern medicine, here shown on the right, prescribed to prolong life in Europe, to Malangan. This is not a Malangan, it's a Bolivian sculpture on the left, but Malangan sculpture carved in Papua New Guinea to mourn a dead person and recall that. So reaching out to a broad public, it certainly, I think, makes a much greater contribution to the understanding of people and cultures than any of the galleries dedicated just very specifically to one people or culture. More specifically, the Wellcome Trust Gallery also illustrates that the scope of Western medicine is actually limited. So this claim that the West has the best to sell is really put into question, just as it underlines that actually a lot of non-Western knowledge has already been lost and is in need of urgent preservation. So I think this is a very meaningful way to move forward, and I can only hope that more museums will at least partially move to thematic themes. And I think this is where, for example, the internet can make a massive contribution, because if you can't move the collection in the museum gallery, you may be able to offer a different interpretation, as Paul has shown also on the internet in the gallery, according to other lines. So communication and education, my second theme, and as we're quite short on time, I wouldn't quite focus here. Well, education has really, education has really come to the forefront in the 19th century, really to make museums less and less elitist. And more recently, outreach, of course, has become really a catchphrase, and I think it's very, very valid to include more and more people into the museum. But I wonder if you wanted to play both the local agenda and the global agenda on the background of limited funding, whether every museum can actually do that, and whether every museum should do it. I think museums will have to choose whether they want to be local players or be global players, and then adopt their strategies and their funding accordingly. And I worked for a while for the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, and it desperately tried to do both on a budget which was not enough for either. And all I can say is it ended up serving neither the local dimension nor the global dimension, nor the regional one, which of course is in the middle as well, in the way it should have done. So how can the museum best serve minority and majority interests in terms of communication and education? How can a museum like the British Museum, which describes itself as an institution, and I quote, intended for use by the citizens of the world, unquote, interest and educate both the elderly lady in the council estate around the corner in Camden, as well as the young, or in this case not so young, Arab banker in Dubai, and this is Saad Zaman, who's really interested actually in the British Museum, and who's the chief executive of the Dubai Islamic Bank. The answer, I argue, although there's of course limits to digital representation, is the internet. That is to say, exploiting the virtual possibilities to complement, and I'm not saying replace, and complement and extend material realities. I appreciate that Walter Benjamin already questioned to what extent the non-original could ever have the aura of an original. Just as, of course, there's problems with André Malraux's approach advanced in the 1940s that, well, if you interpret, the other against your own background, it's not going to be the right interpretation. So yes, there are certainly problems, but I nonetheless think that at least younger and hopefully also older users, as they get used to the internet, will really appreciate what is on offer, and that it will break down those issues attached to physical as well as intellectual access. And I thought it was very interesting yesterday when Caroline talked about various projects she had worked on, and she said, well, how on earth are you going to actually meet all the different communities and interests and levels of interests in the same space? Is one label enough for everybody? Somebody else wants something more, something less. So I think, again, the internet could actually really offer information at different levels, and visitors could kind of choose to what depth they would like to go. They could also continue their study at home, but most importantly, I think it would actually also enable somebody like the Arab banker you see here, talking to his counterpart in London, to actually talk about things on the same basis, having seen the same thing. All I can say from my experience when I worked in I worked for an international auction house, so I talked a lot about works of art. But I had Japanese colleagues who actually consulted the Dresden Gallery, an online exhibition, and I would have Japanese colleagues saying, Uta, I've seen the online exhibition in Dresden, what do you think? And that's how we would actually start our day, and I think that's incredibly valuable. So yes, I think digital resources extending the material collection can really give museums, provide a more human face within globalization. But, of course, how are you going to manage this? I think this radical shift from a museum that will increasingly have a greater digital dimension is going to be problematic, both in terms of management as well as funding. So as regards to the management, does present museum staff have the expertise and willpower to take on the challenges ahead? At the British Museum, it looks as if it's accepted. I can only say from my experience at the Fitzwilliam Museum that it was certainly not accepted. Can complementary project staff always make up for shortcomings on the side of the permanent museum staff? Well, no, because project contracts are actually usually quite limited, and there's no continuation. So what is required long-term, short-term for the long-term, is a much closer and more stable cooperation between curators, education specialists, communication specialists, IT people, project managers, paid real salaries and not museum salaries. Because what I encountered a lot was, especially on the IT side, because it's so incredibly badly paid, you never actually get the quality staff in to turn a project round. So what happens? The project money is used up, nothing happens, and nothing goes online, and nobody has had anything. And if you talk to people who've done that, this is a pretty common phenomenon. So really quite sad. And there's a real conflict also between those who control the real objects and those who control the virtual objects. And I think it will really put existing hierarchies at risk. It will really lead to more conflict than we have seen already. It will provoke opposition, and it will require competent dispute resolution, which often is not there, especially if you have elderly trustees. As regards to funding, well, who will pay for all of this? Especially when, the national dimension goes more and more international, and you could say, well, why should the British government pay for the benefit of the banker in Dubai? I mean, that's what it really comes down to. To what extent will you need corporate funding, but then actually don't want to have corporate interference? How will this dilemma be resolved? Well, it will put conventional wisdom under pressure. It will again provoke opposition, and it will again require dispute resolution. So, to conclude, what is essentially what is essential is a firm understanding, I think, that museums are central to globalization and not kind of something on the edge. And they really need to be placed at the center of society. And it's got to be understood that they have incredibly valuable information to make available to all levels of society. And that this will require the expertise in the place as well as the funding behind it. And that they are not, some marginal entertainment tool. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Uta, thank you. So we come to our last talk for the session, and then we will have time for dispute resolution in the conversation. And it's a pleasure to welcome our final speaker, Antonio Lopez Jimenez from Murcia, where he is about 2/3 of the way through his PhD.
Yes.
I'm guessing.
I'm studying.
And today he's going to talk to us about museums of the future, material or digital.
Okay, thank you very much for the word. Good morning, dear colleagues, and thank you very much for inviting me here today, despite my English level. I beg all of you your pardon. According to the title with the debate, what role do museums play in the globalization of culture, and focusing on the proposition given by the organization, the museums of the future, material or digital, and here today to talk to you not about the future of the museums that unfortunately I cannot predict, but I'm going to talk to you on how, under my point of view, that future is not absolutely digital, and what the reason that we can find to argue this point of view are. Before starting, I would like to clarify some aspects. On the one hand, that my field study are not related directly to museology, but to the area of picture libraries, which link me strongly with digital work. And on the other hand, that my arguments have to do with the museums if we understand them as classical museums, and with the possibilities that these museums have for becoming digital. The arguments that I defend may be sorted in two different lists. On the one hand, the material aspect connected with hardware systems, storage digital devices, and other tangible gadgets. And on the other hand, we will find more abstract matters like copyright, profit motive in mind, or questions related to the relationships between public and masterworks. Well, moving on to the material aspect, we will find that most of them will be handicaps for the correct development of the digitalization. We will find the wide retirement of the software and hardware systems and the short life of the storage digital devices, which report to us the charge of creating more and more back copies. Other problem arrives with internet, and these are the risks of viruses and other problems connected to the net and the servers. In the same way, a museum cannot depend absolutely on an energetic source, because obviously a museum could not afford losing the masterwork during a blackout. Well, regarding the aspects we have mentioned at the beginning, we could start referring to the copyright and intellectual property. A digitalized museum could expose the image of its masterworks on the net. And this means that the museum's content will become vulnerable works, as it is impossible to protect an image on internet 100%. But it has a compensation in the picture libraries, configured as a new model of artistic image manager, with a profit motive in mind. These picture libraries take the works and offer them online in order to sell them. Other question to bear in mind is the kind of public that the digital museum could have. Are we sure that our generations will understand the new digital language, or are we excluding them from the new museums? And last but not least, what's happening with the relationships between public and masterwork? Will we remain the concept of aura defended by Walter Benjamin, and will resign the public with the reproductions? Bearing in mind the problems that the museum should resolve before being completely digital, we will talk about an influence of the digital world, but not a replacement. The museums will always be physical, although they will incorporate digital elements which will go to different sides. First, all right. Sorry. Yes. First, to complement the original work, exhibited or not. Second, to widen the possibilities of remote access to the images of the artwork. Third, to increase the perspectives and possibilities of studying the works, and finally, improving the conservation and restoration conditions. A very clear example in order to illustrate one of the aspects of that combination is the creation of gig-pixel image applied to the museum works. The result is an image which is going to give us the chance of enlarging it until we can see, just with a glance, aspect which otherwise could only be spotted under the microscope, as you can see in this example. So this work is the Garden of the Delights at the Museo del Prado in Madrid, offered online by Google Earth. Here you can zoom the picture as much as you want. Once, twice, 3 times, 4, 5, 6, 7, until you spot the smallest details. This particular that we can see here is placed in this point of the picture. You can see it. I hope it. Okay. Moving on to other question, we can say that the digital sphere will always adapt in a perfect way to the field of management and administration of the museum. The contents of a museum are accessible from looking them up, not only the visible one, I repeat, but also those which are not exhibited through a digital catalog of the works. The files have a digital format. The system of filing will be replaced by those managed by the electronic document management system. The analogical photography is replaced by the digital, and the classically understood office will move toward the new model of office without papers. In conclusion, I have to say that despite the problem that the digital world brings, it is a reality in our museums. They are becoming hybrids at the same time that they are adopting new digital technologies. So, the last question I propose to reflect on is, why reading these lines from an absolutely point of view? Why physical or digital? And finally, why not both? Well, I hope my presentation was clear. It's been a great pleasure to share these lines with you today, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Antonio. So, may I ask the panel to reconvene? So we've got a very good range of issues and questions that have come up. We've got the problematizing of the dichotomy of virtual versus material. We've got lots of sort of external, exogenous issues to think about. Outreach, funding, the complexities of copyright and digital sustainability. And we've got about 25 minutes to discuss all of that. So, may I have your questions, please? Frederick.
I would like to ask Uta something, if I may.
Sorry. No, you don't have to ask permission of Naomi, but you can.
Rightly so, she said she was provocative. And I would like to ask you about the idea of the thematic exhibitions, which I find is an extremely ideological mindset. By putting different things together in thematic ways, you actually always underline the sameness and the likeness of human expressions. Could you please elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, first of all, I should say that I don't envisage that, the kind of chronological exhibition disappears altogether. What I intended to put forward is like an alternative entry point to approach a collection. I worked on one collection which was completely hung with an art gallery in a very conventional way. And most people found it quite difficult to access because, well, it would just say like Van Dyck, portrait of oil on canvas, well, as if you can't actually see yourself. I reinterpreted that collection by theme, using fairly popular things such as scandal, love, discovery, so on and so forth, like a whole range. And a lot of people did actually appreciate an alternative entry point and an alternative linkage between objects across galleries, which they had not really seen before. So yes, I mean, there is a degree of control in it, but again, that was done in an interactive way where people could actually provide feedback. And, I had negative feedback, but overall I also had a lot of positive feedback. So it was
similar to the relabeling thing, then putting tags in.
But you see, this is really the problem. You're dealing, like Caroline said yesterday, with children age 5 to somebody who's blind age 80 to somebody who's on the internet in Dubai and somewhere else. And how on earth in a museum will you actually provide the information? I mean, if you all put that onto labels, your object would actually disappear. So I think one good way is actually, using the internet to provide these different layers.
Dominic.
I'm actually taking up a point that Gabriela mentioned this morning about the kind of maybe openness with that the Museum only provides, but not giving any introduction. And in my talk, I tried to sketch how the taxonomies of old collections and the collections themselves really limit people very much down to what they can do with collections and how inflexible they are. And all 4 of you have now kind of mentioned how much more dynamic and flexible virtual or in that case digital projects could be. But my own experience actually is very different from that, and I think we've all had these frustrating moments where your computer, you just want to fuse 2 things and the technical barriers are actually preventing you from doing something perfectly logical. And the thing that that reminded me of this was the tags and comment function that Paul kind of brought to us. And I remembered, okay, this is now a very interesting possibility, but for the last 10 years, we didn't have tags and probably not comments. So I mean, the limitations of these digital projects are very apparent, and I would strongly advise against seeing this as a quick fix solution. In the end, actually, we all know how old websites, how quickly they age, and how limited the possibilities are actually. So if you want to reflect on this a little, please do.
Do you want to come back? Because I feel like that's picking up on several points from several papers, and then we'll come back to analysis. So if we leave the mic here. Sorry, Al.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's all true, but I think technologies, it's not that suddenly we've got a point where technologies change. I mean, technologies have always been changing, and I suppose part of the message is that, I mean, maybe there's been an acceleration of change, particularly when it comes to digital kind of resources and so on, but I suppose one of the points is not to, again, divorce the digital or any particular technology from the broader context. It's all about trying to embed things and get away from the dichotomization and fetishization, as I see it, of particular technologies. So I suppose above all, the message is museums are not static. Museums need to be dynamic. People responsible for museums need to constantly rethink what on earth this thing, the museum, is, and why we should be fixed into a particular idea of it. It seems absurd to me. And this idea that the museum's only about collections defined in this kind of a way, or these kind of communication technologies, but not those kind of communication technologies. So this suggestion isn't, oh, this is the fix, and now we don't have any problems. It's like this is maybe an interesting way of engaging with the problem that we're facing at the moment, and in 2 years' time we'll be facing other kinds of problems, and hey, we'll have to constantly keep rethinking how we're going to address them. It's not, there's no fix, is there? It's just trying to negotiate a minefield of complications that will always exist, even if the particular complications might change and will, change form. So.
If I could well, sorry.
Antonio, do you want to respond to that, or Maria, do you want to? Yeah. So,
no, I think that the question is also how much we have to understand, and it is useful to understand everything, or understand too much. I mean, about the aura of the objects, of the original, and Butler Benjamin. I think that it is also useful that the objects and the museums serve a kind of mystery. When we think about Wunderkammer or the scientific museums I was speaking of, obviously they are built on, they are displayed to understand, to elicit understanding, but they serve a kind of mystery that maybe is not a bad thing. In the opposite, lately, I see also a too wide, a too exaggerate, will to explain everything. That I don't know that it is truly useful, above all for the children. All this, this displayed thought for the children, and the department of museums dedicated to the children. I mean, when I was a young girl, a little baby, my parents took me around the world, seeing lots of museums. Nobody explained me anything, and maybe that's why I'm still trying to understand.
Antonio, do you want to respond?
Well, I would like to say something interesting, but I'm not sure to it. Well, we are speaking about the relationship that there is between digital and real works. So, as I have already said, I think that will not arrive the moment to do the real substitution of the real work. I think it never will be alright, because I think with the technologies that we have in that moment, and we have virtual reality, we have digitalization, we have everything, but the real object that you can see in a museum, it will be over there. So I mean, if you go to Madrid, because you go to visit the Reina Sofia Museum, and you go to observe the Guernica of Picasso, you want to observe it. You don't want to visit a reproduction or a hologram of the Guernica of Picasso. However, there is another point of view in order to speak about that. Spain as well, there is a very important cave in the north of Spain where you can find the Altamira pictures, prehistoric pictures. In this place is already done a new cave, new cave, and people goes to visit this new cave and not to visit the other one. So I don't know, maybe if for the people it's okay go to visit a reproduction. I don't know, maybe in the future people will go to visit the reproduction of masterworks, and the masterwork will be in the basement of the museums. I don't know, I don't hope it comes.
Well, let's resume contributions from the audience. So
Could I just maybe get back to that?
Yes, absolutely. And then if you can pass the mic to Mads, and then if Mads can pass the mic to
Okay, because I think I probably didn't make myself clear enough. What I was talking about was not the aura of the objects, but really that the idea is that museums are actually lagging so far behind of probably our own research, because it is so much work to just take the object out of the shelf, rearrange everything, and then build new cases every 2 years, and that the internet would somehow help this. But I'm actually quite skeptical that the virtual repository that you're building is more flexible than the physical one, and Uta's mentioning that the amount of money needed to kind of constantly update this is actually maybe a lot higher than just dealing with the real objects that you have in the museum, especially considering that you need all this external expert knowledge, which actually makes it a lot harder for people who are qualified to deal with the objects to actually work on this digital as well. So I think actually the digital repository might be just as burdensome as the physical taxonomies have been. That was my point, sorry.
I have a comment there.
A quick response.
Yeah, just a very quick response, but just to say that one of the problems with the digital is that whoever works with it thinks it's absolutely limitless. So the expectations are just really huge, and when it comes to like the management of a collection, like the amount of boxes that were installed in the museums I saw to capture the details of one document were actually much more than I'd ever seen in paper format. So in a way, I felt that very often way too much information was like put into the system too quickly, and the same system was also on the back of it meant to be an interpretative tool, and the whole thing became so complex that it just collapsed. And I think this whole process just has to be done in a much more structured way.
So if we can go to Mads now, please.
Thank you for a range of interesting papers, and I have a question for Paul. I really enjoyed that paper, and especially your introductory unsettling of the distinction between the real and the unreal and all that, and the whole reminding us of how we should see the traditional museum as also a very simulated and orchestrated environment. But then I have a question about, in the second part of your paper, you came to these very interesting examples, and you were talking about all the R's and all the REs, the reanimation, the recontextualization, and that seemed to me, I'm not sure there's a tension between this introductory position of yours, but in a sense, all this re-discourse which pops up all over the museum world, reenacting and all that sort of course, seems to me to sort of imply that very old school realism kind of way in which you're trying to avoid. So, for instance, when you talk about reanimation and recontextualization, and with this, for instance, this Tropenmuseum show, which you showed us, how are we to avoid to give the visitor the impression that this is, in fact, a reproduction of the real life experience in West Africa, wherever. Do you see what I mean? And how does this discourse of reanimation, recontextualization, avoid speaking back to this realism, old school realism?
Can we collect a couple of more points, Paul, before you respond? Is that all right? So we go to Susan next, and then to Caroline, if that's possible.
Well, actually, I think I just had a simple question. Well, maybe a remark first, and a simple question. I like to look at things from the visitor's point of view. And out there in internet world, it just seems to me there's a longing for trusted places to go for information, and that I think the museums will end up being among those trusted places because there's so many untrusted places out in the internet world. So although it's going to be mechanically really hard to put all this stuff online, perhaps people are looking for it or need it in some way. Anyway, that's my remark. My second question is just physically, the examples you gave of the new media, the object theater, was kind of interesting, and I'm wondering how people use it. Like, how long do they stay? Do they press all the buttons? How do they interact with it, and does it work?
The trouble using that.
Yeah. It's that kind of object theater I've seen used at heritage sites and so on. So I'm interested in a museum setting. Okay.
Thanks. I had a couple of questions to everyone, I guess. First of all, it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, but all the things that you're talking about are based on access to the internet being free, all these things being freely available on the internet, which I don't think we can assume will remain the case. And I guess being someone interested in archives, it's certainly not the case in Britain with archives. Things like the National Census, which has gone online, it's actually incredibly expensive to access. But the fact that it is online has been used as a justification by the National Archives to reduce access to it physically, which is free. So there used to be a place in central London where you could go and search for it for free, which has now been closed. So there's perhaps a paradox that things are being put on the internet and initially they're free and then they start to be charged for and then they're very expensive, and then but by the time you turned around, your access to those things is really difficult anyway. So what happens when these things aren't free anymore? Is that a problem? And then the other thing with some of the projects I've been involved with here is that often they end up on the internet. So once they're finished, or temporary exhibitions, whatever, they're finished, they go up on the internet, and that's supposed to be great. But fundamentally it means this work that has been challenging, or it happens in lots of contexts, remains virtual, and the museum itself, the physical space of the museum, remains absolutely the same. It doesn't have to change at all. So if you're interested in queer history, it's one example I think of, you might go to a particular museum website and look at the way queer history has influenced that exhibition. But for people, perhaps, as we said yesterday, who are interested in these spaces being preserved as they are to maintain a certain way of life and a certain idea, perhaps about your national identity or certain ideas of Britishness, they're probably not going to go to the website and look up an online exhibition on queer history. And when they go to that physical space, nothing in that space is going to challenge them or tell them anything about the fact that there's been this kind of reassessment of the collection. So it's just, those are sort of two issues that I'd like to hear some comment on, if possible.
Alison, may I add a supplementary? Which is that were we to be having these London debates on this theme this time next year, I think the whole funding issue will be staring us in the face, because many of the digital media we've been hearing about are supported by charitable foundations, museums who depend on raising income from the voluntary, from the private sector. And the big players will just not be putting money into this over the next 5 years or so. The Getty, Museum of Metropolitan, etc., British Museum. So I think it is going to be about what are priorities, what is sustainability for the project. Everything may be done potentially, but funding for it is going to be harder and harder to secure.
I'm still a bit vague on the detail of this, but of course there is massive European funding, and as well as they're being interested in cultural heritage in a way they're not interested in literary studies, for example, they're also interested in infrastructure. There is a sort of desperate attempt among humanities to show that infrastructure is not just the thing that is important for scientists. And this is a very particularly good example of where those two things might coincide and be a very good source for applying for funding. I'll try and find out more about where those... initially there's work being done on just listing the kinds of things which are essential infrastructures for humanities. But beyond the listing, I think there's also support available somewhere down the line. So it might be that there's a move from the private to the public.
As long as they stop buying second homes. So shall we return to the panel with Paul?
Go on, me first. No, there's lots of interesting questions there. Matt's point. I'm not entirely sure. I didn't mean to suggest that all this is not some kind of Baudrillard kind of like simulation, all this simulation kind of thing, and that wasn't really what I was kind of getting at. In some senses, I am the realist discourse. I'm not sure I'm suggesting that's to be rejected, and neither am I suggesting that the original, as it were, is somehow becoming irrelevant. Although my reading of Benjamin's thing on aura is somewhat different. My understanding is that actually, you know, Benjamin suggested the museum is a classic example of something that destroys aura. The aura is a social construct which is about the inability to access something. And therefore the aura is constructed of this being some kind of, you know, magical thing which one knows. So the very ability to observe something closely destroys aura. That you know, maybe I've got that wrong, but that was my you know, that in terms of the aura thing. So actually, the museum is a technology which destroys aura because it makes it accessible. In some respects, maybe these virtual or digital things make them less accessible. Maybe the original, actually, the aura is constructed in that kind of way. But yeah, I don't. I think that maybe it's about making sure. I don't think people are confused about whether the image and the real thing. In a way, it's less didactic. It's about juxtapositions. It's about collage, if you like. So you have moving image, and the Sierra Leone project was a bit like this insofar as it's about juxtapositions of different contextual things, and it's again, the emphasis is on you, the experiencer, let's say, to make sense of the connections. What's the connection between the audio track we're hearing and this object? What's the connection between this archival video or film we're watching and the material object behind the glass there? What's the connection between this map and this object? So in some senses, I think it's, you know, it's about the work that's put on the audience, which comes back to something that was raised yesterday about the elite kind of approach to these things. So it is about navigating things that are, you know, making the connections as the audience. But I'm sure there is probably a realist discourse, you know, which is saying, you know, the kind of thing. It's returning some kind of something, or I think reanimating I preferred. I mean, in that case I found it quite literal, because suddenly you see something that's very static, suddenly dynamic, which is closer to how one experiences it. Probably doesn't really get to the deeper question you're asking, because I'm not quite sure what to answer. Caroline's point, I wanted to come back to that. I mean, yeah, I'm not so convinced that this is all the internet will turn into this. I mean, I think the example you made of the census is an interesting one and really problematic. And of course, that's the kind of cashing in on family history, basically, as a huge money spinner. And that's really disappointing that there are not alternative ways to access, easy alternative ways to access those records. But I'm not sure if there actually are, if you are researching. I think anyway. I'm not sure, but I think that because talking to people who are creating digital archives of art collections and other things, actually the movement's in the opposite direction, like relinquishing of copyright. Because this idea that these images of objects are all about, you know, we have to control them because we're going to make money out of them, selling them to people who are going to publish them. And actually, when people do the sums, there's very little. I mean, with exception, and particularly fine art is the exception. Very little money is made that way, and people are saying, what the hell, you know, if people want to use them for their school projects, and you know, that's fine, and if one leaks out somewhere and is published without our permission, well, you know, we're really going to sue. But I think, coming back to what I felt was the other question there, that physical museum spaces are changing. I mean, there are, you know, I mean, and the contextual display is nothing new, and you know, I mean, I think you say Anthony Shelton, some of his earlier work, you know, at Brighton, for instance, and there are certainly both the traditional ethnographic or world art, as they've been rebranded, galleries, but you also have, the same kinds of objects then juxtaposed with fine art collections, with local collections and so on themes like the body or mind or performance and things like this. I mean, and that's as a result of changing ideas about what a museum is and how it should communicate and so on. So it's much slower, but I'm not convinced that the physical museum spaces are ever the same and static, whilst there's this kind of scratch pad kind of area of the digital. I think, you know, with imaginative designers and so on those in redevelopment contexts, the critique is being kind of addressed. slowly, too slowly.
If we begin to wrap up, but if other people on the panel want to pick up on any of these issues about, and also some of the issues we've not touched on there, funding and what happens to websites that were once there and are no longer there, and the issue of trust, the sense that museums are an educational resource that people have faith in and an important medium of knowledge in that way. And so if we just take answers from the remaining three panellists, and then we'll close up for lunch, if that's all right.
I just wanted to say that, of course, the relationship of the digital to the material is at very different levels. So you could have it as an interpretive tool in the museum. You could have it as a resource of the museum that you access outside, or at the most extreme, you could have a museum that only exists in the digital, such as the so-called Museum Without Frontiers. So very different levels, which, coming back to your question, what is free and what will be at what cost, I have no answer, but I think what will happen is that depending on what level it is, something will remain free and other things may well end up having a charge. And something I find problematic is looking at the history of the Museum Without Frontiers, really, is that it's not an independent initiative. It completely ties in whatever is the key initiative of the European Union. So it started off being like exhibitions, which initially were all within the Austrian context, because the initial idea came out of Austria, and it was about the Gothic and the Baroque in Tyrol and in Austria. And now it's essentially turned into an Islamic museum, trying to pull together, the Mediterranean with Europe. And, well, great, interesting, but, it's like, to what extent are we going to be exposed to political agendas that come out of a completely different context, that then reflect in funding and shape the way what we're going to see on the internet?
I have no more things to say. However, I would like to say that I agree with Uta, because we have another kind of works that are digital works. So digital artists that is doing digital art. And for this kind of art, I think that obviously the digital sphere is the best one to show the works, and maybe the future will be a masterwork, or maybe there is already a masterwork, digital masterwork. I am not sure about that, but just say it.
I want to add just one little thing. I want to stress that I don't mean with my speech that I think that digital sources are an horrible thing or not useful or useful thing. It's absolutely a chance, but handled with care. We have to use it and just to keep in touch, in direct touch, in a more close touch with the object. So in this sense, rediscover the aura of the object, and not to switch the attention. We have to pay attention that the visitor is centered around the object and not around the other things we created. The museum has to be attractive institutions, but also a cultural institution whose first aim must be, in my opinion, the education. That's what I wanted to say.
And there's a mission statement to end with. Echoing Chair yesterday. It remains for me to say thank you to everybody and let us have lunch.